Hey, I'm Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co., and today I'm reviewing Valka from Terrible Games. Valka is a 1 to 8 player card-driven system with multiple game modes, from a solo game, from a multiplayer, from a 2-player mode, from bounty hunter, from all these different modes to it, although I'd say that primarily you're looking at a multiplayer experience with variations to it, and then a solo-driven system that has some elements of similarity, but is very much a different game, just utilizing the same framework. The game over here, by the way, everything you see, rules, components, all of that, subject to change. This is a prototype, and I'll have a link to the crowdfunding campaign down below. But with that, this game is a little bit hard to get into because there are so many ways to teach it, but I'll focus primarily on a short overview of the solo and a short overview of the multiplayer. The multiplayer mode is basically going to have you drawing cards from this deck over here, and you're going to be drawing primarily events, various fighters, and various boons to add on to those fighters. So you can see over here we have fighters, we have boons adding to their attack, to their health, and you can add boons to those fighters. We have a front line, we have a back line, and that's going to be an individual player setup, but you're going to start with a 10 card draft. As you draft 10 cards, look at them over here, choose the ones you want, and then potentially discard any others and draw back up to 10. That's going to be your starting hand and how you start off by creating your front line and back line in the game. Throughout the course of the game, you'll be drawing more cards and be able to add more cards to your front line and back line, but ultimately what you're trying to do is you're trying to build the best combination of cards, and that's going to be a combination of the fighters and their stats, whether those fighters are part of the same warband, because potentially if you do that, you'll be able to activate a bunch of boons. If you have 2 or 3 fighters from the same warband, you'll get different benefits. Then you're also adding various buffs to those fighters, so you can go ahead and probably take advantage of them, and then having a back line of various cards that your opponent will not be able to see until you choose to reveal them, or until they get drawn up to the front line. That's the core idea of what you're setting up for. On your turn, you have a bunch of actions you can take, but ultimately a big part of it is all of your fighters are going to be fighting against other players in the game. And again, this is a multiplayer system, so it's not just a 1 versus 1, although there is a separate duel mode, but rather you'll be picking your fighter and going head to head against various players at the table, trying to take them down slowly but surely, trying to determine a degree of agency over the types of attacks you engage in, whether you try to go head to head just rolling for your stats, whether you go for a last strike and guaranteeing you do damage, whether you do a team attack against the opponents. There's a bunch of ways you can try to control how you actually attack the others, and what you're going to try to do based on the events, based on the buffs, all these things going on, but ultimately, you're trying to build the best line of combat to be able to take down your opponents. The duel mode is going to be very similar to that, but the duel mode is slightly different. It's slightly more catered towards 2 players, giving you a bit more of a card draft and more control, giving you more starting cards, and then going head to head, but it utilizes the same function. And I won't go into other game modes on the multiplayer side, but I will now talk about the solo mode, because the solo mode is a very different experience. The solo mode of the game is going to give you the same infrastructure, so you're utilizing these same warbands. You are adding this entire deck of event cards over here that's not present in the multiplayer mode, and you're going to be going ahead and creating, there's a whole bunch of rules as far as how you do it that are a little bit tedious, but there are a bunch of rules as far as how you create the various decks and cards in your own warband, the opposing warbands, who's in play and all that, but ultimately you're going to have a bunch of stacks of cards that are down over here, and you are trying to go through these, revealing cards one at a time, dealing with the events or fighters or whatnot as you go through these piles, trying to slowly take down all these piles and go through your own solo adventure and make it through, not necessarily unscathed, because that's less likely, but as unscathed as possible, I'd say. Trying to be as efficient as possible, trying to utilize your own little board over here to manage your stamina, to manage your health, all of that as you go through, well, your health's really more on your fighters, as you go through this solo adventure. That's kind of the 2 core aspects of this game. Again, they utilize the same cards, but I'd say that the dual mode versus the multiplayer normal mode, those just are the same basic game, versus the solo is very much its own beast. Which brings us, I guess, to that's kind of how the game system plays, or game systems play, but I guess let's go ahead from there and dive into the review. There's a lot of things we're not really heavily covering the exact sequence of how these play out. It's a little trickier covering what's effectively 2 different games on the table at the same time, but let's go ahead and talk about my opinion, my experience with the game, where I am with it so far. And to that end, let's start with ease of play, and ease of play is a bit of a mix. The rulebook, it's very much in prototype phase, so there's still a lot of grace in terms of that, but I wouldn't say the rules were the easiest to follow. Part of it is there are 2 different systems at play, and some of it is going to come down to the interactions in the cards themselves, but overall it was not the hardest to learn each of the separate modes, just a little bit of reading between the lines. I think some more examples could have been helpful to make things a bit clearer, but ultimately it was easy enough to get up and running with the game. As far as what I like, don't like, and can see others not liking, starting off with what I like, which is the frontline, backline mechanic and the degree of agency you have over what you're trying to gather and add to your cards over here. Because you're going to start off with that hand of 10 cards, and you're going to try to, and again, depends multiplayer mode or 2-player mode, but you're going to start off with that hand of cards and trying to build out the best combination of the way things will work for you, and that means your first decision, the most important decision you're going to make in this game, is choosing what to discard and hopefully draw back up to replace it, so you can hopefully end up with a coherent set of cards that are better than whatever your opponent has. And you're going to be making that decision all the time, by the way. Whenever you draw new cards every single turn, you always have the option to push your luck effectively, discarding cards that may or may not be good, hoping to draw cards that are better for you. And so that card draw system, that ability to just try to control as much as possible, going through as much of the deck as possible to get, a combined warband, or the right buffer or boon for your situation, or those events, because the events are incredibly strong and incredibly opportunistic as far as being the right time to play them. You're going to have a whole list of the various warbands and their boons over here, and you're going to have all the event cards over here, because it won't actually show you on the card themselves any text, unfortunately. Same with the warbands, you'll have to reference that play array to see what things are doing in the game. But the ability to try to control around your front and back line, to draw cards and hopefully build out a coherent system, is going to be the biggest part of the strategy in the game, at least for me. There's also going to be some agency over the different types of attacks you're taking over every single turn, but I'd say for the most part, it's more about how you assemble your cards and what you're putting together and what you can push your luck into past any large sense of control over the battlefield. At least for myself, I felt less control of the battlefield and more control over how, well, not necessarily control so much as pushing my luck towards trying to find what I can to be able to build out a good set of units to be able to take down my opponents. The fact that there's different ways to play the game. There's a dual mode, there's multiple other multiplayer modes, there's a solo mode, so there's a bunch of ways to go ahead and dive into the experience, but ultimately it's a game about trying to build out your roster and see how well that roster does for you as you navigate and go through the experience. As far as what I don't like in the game, there's a few things that I didn't really love. First of all, that player aid aspect, the fact that so many things are kind of relegated to player aid. So you draw a card and it says Fear. What does Fear do? Well, let's go ahead and find out what Fear does. Fear is going to declare an enemy frontline fighter and send them to the player's backline, discard all buffs. That's what Fear does, sends a player back. But you have to look through this entire sheet over here. Until you know the game a little better, you're constantly going to be referencing that sheet for both the warband boons that you're dealing with, as well as the various event cards in play. It gives the cards a nice aesthetic because you don't have any, any text over here on the game, but you do have to worry about, okay, great, what does this card do? What does this card do? Whenever you see a new card, what does it, well, it's the same one over there, but what does Divine Aid do? Divine Aid's actually pretty fun, but what do all these cards do as far as giving you the different options of the table, and you just don't know until you reference the sheet. It's not the worst, but it's just one of the small things that gets in the way of an easy, clean experience, although it does make the cards nice and aesthetically pleasing when you're actually know the game and don't have to reference that sheet anymore. I'll say that it feels like a lot of it comes down to the card draw. It comes down to just whatever cards are going to be in play, meaning for the most part, and I already kind of touched upon this in terms of the things I like, but it's also the counter of it is the things I don't like, which is a lot of it seems to come down to the cards you're able to gather and put together, and then from there, it's kind of just playing it out. There's decision making, to be clear, there is decision making at play, but to me, the biggest sense of the decision I have in the game comes down to actually assembling the cards I'm utilizing, and less so what I do with them as I actually play through the game. I feel like a lot of it's like, okay, great, I got a good warband in play, I have these buffs over here, and now we're just going to go ahead and do the obvious things to try to win the game. I'll say as far as the solo mode goes, because again, reviewing two different experiences at the same time here, as far as the solo mode goes, I would say I very much felt like a passenger on that journey. You're going to go ahead and assemble the decks, and again, there's a lot of tediousness to actually setting it up. Nothing crazy, but it's one of those things that's overwhelming at first. It'll get easier as you go through it, but more steps than I'd like to set up the solo game. But past that, once you're going through that, I'd say that the journey feels very much on rails, at least for myself. I didn't feel a strong sense of decision making as I went through the solo, and I'd say I had less sense of how I built out my faction compared to the multiplayer. So the solo was kind of a similar procedural, let's go through this, and it could be a fun journey if you're just in it for the same sense of the journey, but I had much less agency over the solo mode than I would ideally like, because it utilizes the same infrastructure with differences as the multiplayer mode, but less creative control over how I can combine a bunch of cards to be able to dive into that. As far as final thoughts on Valka, Valka for me is one that has aspects of it that are certainly enjoyable, and I think that building out the factions are the best thing. Trying to push yourself to gather new cards and build out a good front line and back line, and to repeat that process, adding to it every single turn, that's the most fun. There's a sense of push your luck in the game system. There's a sense of trying to just get things that work for you and gather that, hey, this card might be good for me, this +1 attack boost, but if I discard it and hope to draw something else, maybe I'll get that event that's really helpful. And as you learn the system a bit more, that becomes a little bit even easier to try to figure out, or not necessarily easier, more rewarding to know when to push your luck hoping for better cards versus when to let go and say this is good enough, or it's good enough for the situation at hand. But overall, I'd say that despite a few things that do work for me in the game, there are too many things that just didn't impress me as much in terms of what I'm doing or how I'm doing it. Ultimately, this is for me is a 3 out of 5. It's an okay experience, I've had fun with it, but I can't say the decision space was as involved as what I want, while also trying to present as being more involved as you go through it, and so ultimately the it left me wanting a bit more, either just casual chaos or a bit more control, but kind of picking a lane of one of those two things. So that's going to be Valka, a 3 out of 5 for me. As far as other game recommendations, I'm going to kind of divide this up into solo versus multiplayer. If you're looking for a solo game that's going to give you a fun little card challenging puzzle, I highly recommend Skytier Horde from, well, I think Skytier Games, but Skytier Horde is going to give you a fun solo challenge, and it could be played multiplayer as well, in which you have a set of cards and you're trying to take down a bunch of enemies in the game. Very, very different mechanically, but if you're looking for that card-driven adventure, I think that will do a good job there. And if you're looking for something that actually kind of weirdly feels similar to Valka, at least myself, it kind of was very reminiscent of Challengers to me. Whole different theme and ballpark as far as the presentation of the two experiences, but as far as that auto-battler sense, to me, I kind of got a similar vibe from playing Valka as I have from playing Challengers, of drawing cards, of trying to build together a cohesive set of cards, of hoping for the best by discarding and drawing more cards, just trying to find the right combinations of things, and then just letting the system do its work for you. I think Challengers just leans a bit more into that casual craziness and less into the strategic aspects, but to me, they gave me similar vibes as far as what the systems are doing. In any case, and until next time, I'm Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co. I hope you found this video helpful, and as always, I hope you have a good one.